Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. This is Omar Dexter again from the UK, and joining me all the way from Australia again is Brother Musa Ser Antonio. I'm going to talk a little bit about history to start with, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Brother Omar. And indeed, at that time, you'd see the rulers were quite just. Now, there was two main peaks where the Muslim Ummah was threatened at this time. The first one happened about 300 years in. What happened was the Muslims who had stayed in that one area of Spain had really built themselves up. They'd been waiting all of this time. And finally, they started to push forward. And they were really taking a lot of land. They would have had help from all of the Christians throughout Europe.
All the people that was happy to live under Muslim rule, knowing what it was.
Indeed. So the Christians were pushing down. And what had happened was the Khalifa, he knew that at that time, the state wasn't very strong. Some of the people had fallen back. And if you look at the accounts in history, you'll see that wine drinking was prevalent. You'll see that Muslims were involved in statue making, dancing, music, all of these things which are forbidden by Islam. And once these are really thriving, and they weren't just happening in the homes, they were actually happening in the court of the Khalifa.
Wow, right from the top down.
Indeed. Yeah. So when this is happening, you can sort of see that things aren't going as they should Islamically. Things had dropped down over time.
The people, they don't have themselves to blame. There's no complaining to Allah when they are behaving like that, and then they see the result over time.
Indeed, they'd only brought it upon themselves.
Yep. So
now,
the good things is from Allah, and the bad things are from ourselves.
What the Khalifa had decided at this time, he knew that were the Christians to push forward, they wouldn't really have a line of defense. So he thought he hasn't got anyone else in Europe to call upon to help him, because all of their neighbors were basically Christian and they all wanted to push down and defeat the Muslim empire. However, he looked beyond the Mediterranean, and there was a group of Muslims who were basically in what we'd know today as Morocco. Now these were very, very strong Muslims. They were very strong sticking to Islam, unlike how the people had become in Andalus. So you can call them basically the modern Muslims that were in Andalus. They had sort of departed from most of the religion. So the Muslims who were the really practicing religions, they had a suspicion of them. They always liked to keep them out of Spain.
Right.
But at this time, in a time of need, the Khalifa had to make a decision. He said, either I can fight by myself and lose this land, or I can call upon the Muslims to come defend us. But he knew if the Muslims were to come through from northern Africa, they would also take the land, because they would come forward, they would defend the land, and it would be theirs after that.
But surely if they are Muslim, that's a better thing for
of
them,
course.
because they know what it is. Even though many of the people were sinful, they must know deep in their hearts that it was wrong what it was doing.
And basically this was the decision he had to make. And there's an amazing saying that he said regarding this. He said, I would rather be herding camels than herding pigs. And basically the understanding of this was, when the Muslims come from Northern Africa, they're going to bring their camels, the symbol of Arab and Islamic culture.
Sure.
But if the Christians come through, they're going to bring pigs. And we know as Muslims, this is something which is not what we want.
No.
So he had to make this decision, and he made the right decision, which was to call upon the Muslims to come forward and to defend.
Alhamdulillah.
Now these Muslims who were from Northern Africa, they were called the Murabitun in Arabic. Now this word evolved in time in Spanish to become Almoravid. So if you read through the history books, you hear about the Almoravid era of Spain, and that's what we're looking at now. Now these people had come, and you would see, they were very strong Muslims. They were, visibly marked as Muslims, and what they would do, one thing which really stood out, was they would have their faces covered with only their eyes showing, which was something which is, very intimidating, especially on the battlefield. So they'd come forward, these men from the desert, and they come and they really blitzed and they pushed the Christians back. And at the same time, it wasn't just the Christians that they were pushing back. It was also the Muslims which they were coming to put into line. You'll see many of the statues which were flourishing in the palaces at that time, you'll see that they had been defaced, not by the Christians, but by the Muslims. Because these Northern African Muslims come forward and they seen what was happening, and they smashed the bottles of wine. They defaced all of these statues. They come forward and, they were destroying these places of wine drinking, and they were establishing mosques. So at this time, we've seen there was a rebirth of Islam within the Iberian Peninsula. So for the next 400 years, again, the area was under Muslim hands. However, the Murabitun didn't always stay. They eventually drew back, and in time, things changed again. And you had, different groups within Spain, the Arabs, you had the Turks, you had the Berbers, you had the locals, and feelings of nationalism and racism began to tear them apart.
That feeling of we're better than you for some reason.
Yes, unfortunately, again, it took over the Ummah. And again, you had the Muslims and they were fighting with each other. And this is one of the main lessons which you can really learn about the importance of unity and the effects of when you don't have that unity.
That's right. And as soon as you get the pride and arrogance, thinking we're better than them, that's the start of your downfall.
Indeed. What actually happened was when the Christians, again, after about 300-400 years, they had built themselves up again and they started to push down. And the Muslim Empire was really shrinking to only the southern area of Spain. And what the Muslims were doing is because they'd have so much enmity between each other, what they'd do is they'd go to the Christian king and queen at that time and they would say, fight alongside us to help defeat this Muslim enemy. And so that's what would happen. The Christians would fight against that Muslim, and then once they defeated that Muslim, they'd turn on the Muslim who first came to them.
So it's kind of like divide and rule.
Indeed, and the Christians really exploited this, and unfortunately the Muslims fell for it. So while Spain was opened, it was actually first entered because of disunity amongst the Christians. It fell because of disunity amongst the Muslims.
Well, I guess maybe that's just human nature for you. Even though you're given the blueprint how to behave, people, sometimes they just can't help themselves. We are created sinful.
Unfortunately so.
And it just seems that we have these inclinations, and if we don't repent from our sin and correct our actions, we're in big trouble.
Indeed. And of course we have these commands to unite upon the Quran and the Sunnah, to unite upon Islam, to unite as one Jama'ah. We shouldn't tear ourselves amongst each other.
That's often not what you see today. It seems that we haven't learned from these lessons in the past. But there's so much wealth of how to reform ourselves.
So of course here we have an amazing example of just the importance of keeping united and not disuniting, because we see the perils and the effects of what might happen if this were to happen.
Allah's given us the blueprint how to behave, and we should stick to it.
Indeed. As Allah says, to keep united upon the Quran and the Sunnah. Unite as Muslims. Unite in this brotherhood and do not
be divided.
And do not divide yourself. Otherwise defeat is at hand.
And we can see it. Allah says it and it comes true.
Indeed. So what had happened at this time, because the Muslims had been defeated, the Christians sort of put forward an ultimatum to them. You can either convert to Christianity or you can be expelled from the peninsula.
Now that doesn't sound very fair. The Muslims go into the peninsula and let people have the freedom to choose their religion, yet when it's the other way around, it seems that actually it's the Muslims under compulsion to give up their religion, which of course they're not going to do.
Indeed, and of course many of them, where could they go to? I mean, their families have been there for 800 years. You're no longer a foreigner once you've been there for that long.
Yeah.
So originally many of them decided that of course they're not going to convert to Christianity, they're not going to give up their religion, even though they were in a pretty dismal state, still they had this pride in their belief. So most of them had decided to leave.
Or faith in their belief, that strong faith. They knew they was on the truth.
They were uncompromising.
That's right. Uncompromising with regard to Allah's rules, not uncompromising with regard to not getting on with people.
So at this time, many of the Muslims were migrating. They either went to Africa, Northern Africa, Morocco, to Algeria, to these areas. They would have maybe went to Turkey. A lot of them did go to Turkey. But then, strangely enough, you'd think that the Christians would be content that they were leaving. But they weren't happy with this. What they wanted was for them to stay there and either to remain in a very oppressed state or to embrace Christianity, under compulsion, of course. So Muslims were actually forbidden to leave after that point. And what came in this thing called the Reconquest of Spain, you had a group called the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh my goodness.
And basically what the Spanish Inquisition was, they would come and they would be inquisitive. They'd ask you, what is your faith? And if you'd say that you are Muslim, they would basically say, you can either have the sword or you'll be baptized. Now in this time, many of the Muslims, because they were facing such a big fitna, they were facing such big tests, they'd contacted some of their scholars in Northern Africa and they say to them, what should we do? So they were advised by them to pretend to convert sometimes. They said if the pressure was too much and you can't do anything.
For their life, if they really feel that somebody will pull the trigger or slash the sword, they're allowed to denounce their faith as long as they don't believe it in their heart.
So yes, of course, they remain Muslims, but they just said, okay, whatever, just for the sake of their peace and security.
After the mercy of Allah, how He gives people a way out. Say there's no hardship in Islam.
Indeed.
Even in those situations, there's a way out, and maybe they'd find a way to migrate further from then.
Indeed.
I mean, if I was facing that kind of oppression, I would migrate. Someone's telling to me I don't have the freedom to practice my religion. You have to move.
And initially in this reconquest, what had happened was many of the Muslims were, getting baptized, and they'd say, yeah, we're Christian, whatever you want to call us. Yeah. And they'd still continue to gather in their mosque, which now had a cross on top of it.
Right.
So it looked like a church, but they'd go in and they'd still pray.
Got it.
And so the Christians, it was a bit of a joke, like, the new Christians are in the mosque and they're praying Salat al-Asr. So in some time, there was one general at that time, and he was known as General Ximenes. And Ximenes was the one who really pushed for the strong part of the Inquisition, where basically, if you were a practicing Muslim, you could be put to the sword. And it got to a point where it was so extreme that if you had anything that showed a resemblance of being Muslim, you'd be put to the sword. For example, if people would be bathing on Thursday night or Friday morning because it's Jummah time,
of a Muslim, yeah.
You'd be persecuted for this. And things had become so bad at that time. Again, they consulted their scholars. They said, we can't pray openly. What should we do? So the scholars would advise them, make tayammum, which is dry ablution.
Yeah.
And they sometimes, because if you were to do it properly even, they would know that you're a Muslim. So they advise them to brush your hand on the wall, and that will suffice as your wudu. And rather than praying as you usually would, they say, continue walking through the marketplace as you would, but pray and prostrate with your eyes. This is amazing. The limitations that they had.
Even on that situation, Allah gives us a concession.
Of course, we see that still you did have those Muslims who wouldn't give up on their prayer.
Would you?
Of course not. A'udhu billah. Inshallah, we never would. But